Why don't we get started? Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Kolsky, and I am the director of the Albert LePage Center for History in the Public Interest at Villanova University, where I'm also an associate professor of history. And along with my colleague, Dr. Tim McCall, who's an associate professor of art history, we are extremely excited to present to you a panel tonight about decolonizing museums. Those of you who have been with us in September know we are engaged in an ongoing series called Decolonizing History. And in the month of March, we're exploring the sub-thing of decolonizing museums. So we are very excited to have an exciting panel of 3 scholars from around the world who are going to engage in a discussion with us tonight. Before I introduce them, I just want to give a little description of kind of the format of the event. You will maybe have noticed that this is not your regular Zoom meeting. This is a Zoom webinar format, which means you can see us, we can't see you. I don't actually know if you can see each other, but I'm assuming you cannot. So in this format also, we ask that you pose your questions in the chat. We're going to engage in a conversation ranging from 45 to 60 minutes. And we want to leave a good chunk of time, 30 minutes or so, for conversation. If you feel inspired to ask a question while we are engaging in this kind of informal dialogue, just pop it into the, not the chat, I'm sorry, pop it into the Q&A. That's a better place to put it. Excuse me. Pop it into the Q&A. We're going to keep an eye on the Q&A. And towards the end, we'll kind of field those questions. In this particular format, you can't actually voice your question. You have to type it out. Okay. So we hope you will stay with us not only for this event, but also next week. We're going to be back on Wednesday, March 17th at 12:30 with an excellent conversation with Terry Greaves and Jill Yolberg about Indigenous exhibitions. And then in the month of April, we are turning to decolonizing COVID, and we have some absolutely incredible speakers talking about the history of vaccinations, contact tracing, the history of sort of health inequities, history of vaccines. So we hope you'll stay with us. I'll pop in the chat later the link to the series events. But for now, I want to move and introduce our speakers, who I will introduce in alphabetical order. So we have Dr. Dan Hicks, who is a professor of contemporary archaeology at the University of Oxford, where he is also curator of world archaeology at the Pitt Rivers Museum and a fellow of St. Cross College. In 2017, he was awarded the Rivers Medal of the Royal Anthropological Society. Dan's new book, The Brutish Museums, the Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution, was published in 2020 by Pluto Press. It has received rave reviews. You may have caught Dan last week in a conversation with MC Hammer. He has been all over the world talking about this book, which has been described by Ben Okri as, quote, a startling act of conscience, by The Economist as a real game changer, by The Guardian as, quote, beautifully written and carefully argued. CNN called it unsparing. Nature called it timely. The Sunday Times referred to it as destined to be an essential text. And The Brutish Museums was listed as one of the New York Times best art books of 2020, with a recommendation that, quote, if you care about museums and the world, read this book. Quite a statement. So we also have Dr. Ruba Kana'an, who is a historian and an assistant professor of Islamic art and architecture in the Department of Visual Studies at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. She received her doctorate in Islamic art and archaeology from the University of Oxford and her bachelor's in architectural engineering from the University of Jordan. She has wide-ranging professional and scholarly experience spanning the worlds of academia, museums, architectural practice, and community-based arts education. Before joining the faculty at the University of Toronto, she was a founding member of the Aga Khan Museum's leadership team, where she was head of its Department of Education and Scholarly Programs. And Professor Kana'an teaches in the areas of Islamic art. She teaches about the artist in pre-modern Muslim societies And she's interested in the representation of Islamic art in museums and the project of decolonizing Islamic art. And last, we have Chaédria LaBouvier, who is a curator, an art historian, a writer, and an organizer. She's the curator of the critically acclaimed show Basquiat's Defacement. Yes. Thank you, Tim. Tim's been sending me PDFs. I don't actually have the book. I'm like, can we put the book up again? Come on, Tim. There we go. Basquiat's Defacement, which is a superb catalog. Her essay in the catalog is incredible. This show was held at the Guggenheim Museum in 2019. She is the first Black curator in the Guggenheim's 80-year history, as well as the first Black woman and the first person of Cuban descent to curate an exhibition at the Guggenheim. She's also the first Black author of a Guggenheim catalog and the youngest independent curator to mount an exhibition. So quite a series of accomplishments. She has been very outspoken about the racism she received and experienced at the Guggenheim, which created space and inspired a generation of museum and gallery workers to begin speaking up about the toxicity within art world spaces. So if you haven't seen her speaking truth to power, I will pop a few kind of choice Twitter tweets into the chat as we move along, because they're very, very powerful and I think very important and worth listening to. So the way we're gonna run this tonight is we're gonna just try to engage in a dialogue. We have sort of set up a series of questions that we will speak to, but we may run off course. And I encourage all of the panelists to engage. Let's engage with each other. Let's not see this as a kind of a stilted conversation. I want us to be as informal as we can be in this bizarre, weird Zoom environment. So the first kind of thing I've given you these lengthy introductions, but I'm curious if you can talk a little bit to us about your background, your training, how you came to your line of scholarly and professional work. Everybody here has both worked, you all are both writers and museum professionals. So we'd like to just hear a little bit more about your background. Dan, how about we start with you?
Okay, of course, yeah. So yes, I mean, I work in between anthropology and archaeology. And in a lot of ways, my training and sort of work has been about the interactions in between those sort of fields. So here in the UK, it's unusual to have the thing we have at Oxford, which is archaeology having a relationship with anthropology. Often it's thought of as a sort of as a part of history instead. But that interaction for me is a question about where archaeology ends, about the relationships in between objects and ourselves. But also over the years, from quite an early point on, it was an interest really in how these sort of disciplines emerged sort of as a part of empire. So here at the museum, where I've been curator for 14 years, I came here from the Bristol department, where I had been part of the last time round that we attempted to remove Edward Colston in the late 90s, early 2000s. I was doing my doctorate, and so I learned, from that environment, an Atlantic city with ongoing relationships with empire. That observation that empire isn't over. It's in, if you like, it's all around us. That was something which for the, I then arrived in Oxford, and these were conversations that just weren't happening, and that really you at that point were unable to have. So I think that sums up sort of where I've ended up in terms of at an institution where the curator is often thought to keep things the same, to make sure objects don't sort of decay, but where you're never going to stop the world from altering around you.
Thank you. Chaédria.
Yes. Oh. where do I feel very much at the beginning of my scholastic career, in a sense. I actually came not through the normal ways of going up through the system. I come from a film background, so I actually have my MFA in screenwriting from UCLA, and I have a completely different TV writing practice that I'll talk more about like later in the year. But so visually, I orient myself in a cinematic way, and it was a huge influence for me in doing the show. I should have included a screenshot, but there was, when I did the show, one of the things that I did was I superimposed a photo of Keith Haring's studio from which the painting had literally been cut out of. And the idea of that was really cinematically inspired, that a good movie will tell you visually what it's about in the first 45 seconds. And so for me, as someone who is deeply anti-empire and deeply serious about decolonizing these spaces, if they can be, I wanted to use a language that I felt the audience understood. And I think that whatever, in the other show that I did, I believe that, whether you're watching YouTube or movies or Netflix, the audience has a media literacy, even if they're not using that language to describe it. And I think that a way of decolonizing that space is meeting your audience where they are and speaking in a language that they speak and not the way that you want to speak to them. And so I think that in terms of my scholastic interest, one might say, oh, there's like trauma and there's the 80s, and, because I specialize in Basquiat and Keith Haring very directly, but I'm really interested in looking at how the politics of the art of the 1980s developed. And in this case, you can't talk about that without talking about the activism that happened with Michael Stewart, because that also gave rise to the AIDS activism, because it was literally the same people using the same techniques that they had learned organizing for Michael. So I'm really interested as to where that politic inserts itself in the 1980s and how it influences a new generation of artists who are so inspired by the 80s.
Excellent, thank you. Ruba.
Well, I'm a historian of Islamic art, and as you mentioned in the introduction, I started my career in Jordan, a country that you can really call an open-air museum. So my relationship with museums started from archaeology, so to follow up from Dan. And there I became aware of a specific dynamic where you learn on the ground the impact of people and ideas and ideologies on artifacts, where you have both the illegal digs and trade of objects to areas that are sort of still part of empires and interested in acquiring objects, and at the same time the legal infrastructure development and power structures that create projects that exclude objects from being showcased as important. So that sort of that living in the open air museum led me to go into studying Islamic art and architecture. And once I arrived at Oxford for my graduate work, of course, visiting the Pitt River several times and seeing the impact of empire, I realized that the topic that I'm specializing in, Islamic art, is a topic based on a colonial idea on racialized division of objects and hierarchies of arts and representation. And as a result, the whole approach to Islamic art is one of negotiating ideas about power and representation and race, and how it is represented by the different imperial powers in different museums in the world. So from that, I started teaching Islamic art. I've always been interested in teaching about museums, especially that we are at a stage where in the last 20 years, almost 18 new museums and galleries of Islamic art, there's been reinstallation. So ideas of decolonization are very much top of thought. There's so much discussions about them. So of course, I'm not only living that, but also teaching it. And of course, I was involved in the creation of a museum here in Toronto, the Aga Khan Museum, and spent 5 years thinking about how to implement initial ideas and how to try and reflect on those ideas of power and hierarchies within the walls of a museum. And it's a great pleasure to be with my co-panelists and having this discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, we love this. We love just the kind of diversity of approaches and backgrounds that each of you bring. And we're really interested to see how this conversation will be a kind of cross-pollination. So the first thing I just wanted to ask you is a broad question. It speaks to the title of tonight's event. And that is, what does it mean to decolonize museums? Who are museums for? What is the purpose of museums? Why do museums matter? Presumably, the push to decolonize them suggests that they matter. So why do they matter? So this is kind of a cluster of questions I'd love to hear your particular perspectives about. Whoever wants to jump in, go for it.
You go first, Dan.
I'm not calling on anybody. We're grown-ups. I call on my students.
I'll go. So I forgot to include, I had my own little detour in Oxford. I did part of my research in Oxford. Actually, Dan, I did a little research on flags at the Pitt Rivers Museum. Yes, there's a librarian, I think he's Sicilian, who helped. Where he's Southern. Yes. yes. I spent a whole day in the stacks there, and I was staying at Exeter College. So I did a bit of research at Pitt Rivers. Can these spaces be decolonized is really the question that I'm trying to figure out. Museums I think of curating and cinema in tandem oftentimes. And when I think about even the history of cinema, this kind of showcase of white supremacy and empire is embedded in the DNA of cinema. The first blockbuster film, Birth of a Nation, was essentially a Klan rally. And so when I think about museums and the rise of museums, at least in the US, they absolutely coincide with the post-Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, this huge violent stratification of race. And when you think about the role of the curator and how that's changed, so it's a question that I guess my answer is more so I'm still feeling my way through, because museums are a showcase of imperial plunder, of imperial majesty, and it's something to be aspired to, right? Like, these things are beauty ideals, social ideals, and the audience is meant to go in and become enlightened and go and express those ideals in their lived lives. And so I think that which goes into a conversation of beauty standards and empire, which is a completely separate conversation. But museums are really about, we're asking museums which are monuments to empire to not be that. And I don't know if we can do that.
Can I just add here, jump in to say that I think also museums are becoming more relevant in our discussions of decolonization in general, and in our discussion of empire, because the nature of museum itself has changed over the last let's say 25, 30 years, the museum changed from being a place for the specialist, where few specialists meet and talk, and there's this highbrow approach to art and ideas, into a destination, a place where families go, a place where for education, public education, a place where schools go, a place where you have public conversations. And I think also very valid to our conversation, a place that's no longer restricted to its wall. It exists in the digital realm. And as a result, the conversations that used to be had in the museum, which is based, as you say, on the idea of sort of imperial plunder, are now in the public realm and are available for us to talk about, discuss, and think of how they can be decolonized, and also for the curators who are now working both, have a more public interface than they did a few decades ago, are also having to think of these ideas beyond the scholarly approach to these artifacts.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that that really underlines something which is really important about the moment in which we find ourselves now, that what it is to be a curator has sort of changed. So there's no book, I think, which has really seems more sort of dated so fast than, of course, the Neil MacGregor book, The History of the World in 100 Objects, which was only, 10 years ago. But there is the white male UK-based curator who has all the answers, he knows all the history, and the objects are just kind of there to illustrate those histories. They're not even necessarily central to the narrative. But even at the time that Neil was involved in that, already all of the functions of our education work, of the front of house experience, were foregrounding communities and audiences and those people who are part of an institution. So when we, as an institutional move, we start to care for people more than things, that has led, in my view, to the Colonial Museum failing. So this is a failure. And when things fail, we see them. So you're on your way to work and the car won't start. Suddenly in that moment, the car is there, right? You see it in a way that you wouldn't do on any normal day. So as the museum has failed, we have to ask about what it is to is this appropriate language? What do we mean when we call for or we talk about the decolonization of the museum? For me in the UK, I worry a lot about it being an art wash, about it just being a way that almost continues the idea of hiding away the, if you like, the worst excesses of empire to undo empire somehow. So that's obviously not going to happen. I think in a North American context, the decolonization language has a lot of importance for Indigenous and for First Nations and for Native American communities, because there you have the museum is actually on stolen land, as well as being, exhibiting art which was stolen. So instead, here in the UK and the wider European conversation, I like to see not as the decolonial, but the anti-colonial work, which is the unfinished work of anti-racism. And I think the moment we're finding ourselves in, which is a wider cultural moment across sort of, I think across, a number of nations here in Europe, is that we have got to a certain moment with anti-racism in our institutions, and yet we haven't solved it. It is here in our institutions, it's built into them. So at that point, we have to recognize, across really our sort of cultures, that racism isn't just something that comes out of nowhere. It has a history. I think in North America, in the civil rights movement in the 1970s, that was realized in terms of histories of enslavement, in terms of histories of violence against indigenous people. Here in the UK, we haven't, and elsewhere in Europe, we haven't started actually yet to think about what the history of racism is here. But of course, it is the history of empire. And our museums have a relationship with the history of empire, and so does racism have a history, have a relationship with the, if you like, it isn't only the history, it's the ongoing history. It's the sense that empire is with us now in the present, and certain institutions were made in order to make empire and if you like, the way it saw the world, to make them endure. So the museums are important. So we all know that art and things sort of in our museums and the museums themselves, I mean, we all know that that matters. But equally, white supremacists also in the 1880s and the 1890s, in the early part of the 20th century, they also understood that they matter, because these can be vehicles for making a certain world view seem like it's natural, seem like it's always there, and it seems like it's incredibly hard to alter it or to change it. So I think that's where I feel here in Europe, it is an anti-colonial and anti-racist moment that we find ourselves in, more than purely a decolonization one.
Tim, did you want to add something?
Yeah, can I just jump in and kind of building off what all of you all said, then maybe turn more forward. What can museums be if they can't, if they can't be decolonized? How can museums not just sort of include more audiences, but allow them to produce knowledge and consider them real constituent participant communities, and like with this sort of decolonial turn in the museums, which what can they be in 5 or 10 years? What would you all like to see? What are some possibilities?
Well, I think that for the museums to be something different, right? You have to have a radical imagination, like a supremely radical imagination. What I mean by that is sort of what Angela Davis means, is going to the root of things. And so it goes to the education. It goes to how people are trained to teach the work, collect the work. Do we even need collections? Collecting, Toni Morrison says canon is an imperial exercise. Canon is empire. So if you're collecting something with the intent to add representation, we should be thinking, is there even a need to collect? Because that is at its root, a radical enterprise, it's an imperial enterprise. And I made a distinct decision not to do the PhD track because, well, one, the field that I chose to specialize in, without knowing that I was choosing it at 18, I was ahead of the academy. I couldn't go to a university and study with a scholar that, Basquiat, Keith Haring, that's what they did. That's the whole point of going to a PhD program. So I was building the foundation of a field, one of the foundations of a field, without really knowing it when I made that decision at 26 or so. That decision to not go into that imperial training, which I was aware of in a sense, allowed me the freedom to pull from history. My undergraduate training is historiography. So it allowed me to use historiography in a way that art history does not allow. It allowed me to use cinema. It allowed me to use pop culture, and also think of, curating. I don't want to put too much emphasis on curating, but because of the imperial structure, curators sit atop this hierarchical pyramid scheme, right? Which is sort of problematic. And when I think of what curators don't know who've been traditionally educated, how sort of, art history at its structure does not allow for the kind of work that I did and brought to the Guggenheim, which is part of the tension. And so I think that you have to also completely reimagine labor, regulation. Like, this is a deeply unregulated world. We're doing a lot of panels and talks and open letters, but none of that matter. You cannot talk your way out of oppression. There's got to be some sort of apparatus. So we're really talking about regulation. We're talking about complete overhaul of the education of workers within the museum. It's also bringing the security workers, front of house, the janitorial staff into that conversation of a community and conversation of care. And that's what it would completely, if the museum's considered security guards who spend 10 hours a day standing next to works as experts of the works, that is a decolonized space.
I think I'd like to add to that to build on your notion of sort of reimagining the structures. One of the ways that I want to raise sort of how can a museum decolonize, or what anti-colonial approach they can take, are two things related to structure that I'm thinking about. One is the relationship between the visitor and the curator, and the other is the relationship between the structures of the museum, the curatorial departments in a sense, and the art that in them. And I think I want to just briefly give a little anecdote. Here in Canada, we have a brilliant curator, Ruth Phillips, who works with Indigenous Aboriginal North Americans across the Lake districts, of the Great Lake district. At a certain stage, she was the director of the Museum of Anthropology in British Columbia, and she wrote about an experience where a group of elders wanted to have their meeting in the Great Hall of the museum. And they asked to sort of handle a piece that is an exhibit in the museum, collected by the museum and exhibited there, but it is part of a ritual practice that is meaningful for the elders. And one of them wanted to demonstrate what that is for the group that was having their meeting there. And at that moment, that the curator had to decide, do they hand that object, which is an accession museum collected artifact with a certain value, to the person who is going to talk about the practice, considering that the practice itself included breaking that object. And she had to think about that. And of course, she decided that the only way to turn that, and I'm interpreting what she's saying, so I hope I'm interpreting correctly, that the only way to decolonize that relationship, the only way to make that object change the single narrative of the curator talking about the object from a matter of hierarchy and classification and value into a community and relationship, is to hand it over. And the elder held the object, talked about it, talked about the ritual of breaking it without breaking it, and handed it back. So that notion of opening up to communities and learning about what those objects hold as a meaning, other than the single, I would say, secular curatorial view that we as experts impose on objects in a structure of the museum, I think is one of the ways in which museums can go forward. And yes, I will pass.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, I think, what do we do? For some people in the museum sector, this is all about rewriting the labels. Everything's going to be okay if we can just really, well, really, better, really more honestly, simply maintain things as they are, and just it's all about words. And of course, that's an incredibly, dangerous argument, when what we have to do is to physically dismantle. And that really is about responding, in the work I'm doing at the moment, to African voices and long-standing African movements. The Restitution movement, as it's developed over the past 100 years, the Fallism movement, as we saw in Algeria in the 1960s, as we saw with the Rose Must Fall movement in Cape Town in 2015, as we've seen across the American South for the white infrastructure of, Confederate sort of soldiers who are located across the road from the courthouse, right? We have such infrastructure in the book. I call it white infrastructure. We have that white infrastructure in our museums. We are part of what, for an incredibly short period of time, actually, in between the 1880s and the 1930s, essentially, emergent fascism of the German and the British and American form, and that world view that emerged in those nations. At those points, they actually sort of used culture for those reasons. So what we need to do is to foreground and listen to and act upon the voices that have been calling for physical dismantling. So the Rose Must Fall movement understood that the image of the colonialist Rhodes, of the mass murderer Rhodes, at the heart of the academy at UCT, that mattered. It wasn't so those people that say museums, statues, the kind of thing that we do, that's just some sideshow. It's a distraction from the real work of anti-racism, or the real work that needs doing. Those are arguments of people that simply do not understand how important art and culture are, as of course, the fascists understood, and the white supremacists continue to understand. Fundamental, how is it that we have failed to listen to those voices for 100 years? How is it that here at the Pitt Rivers, we've been doing some fairly sort of nice things, a bit like the Ruth Phillips example we just heard, and we were feeling fairly, happy with ourselves. We'd held a potlatch on the anthropology lawn. We'd allowed members of the Haida Nation to take objects out of cases. And then all of a sudden, the Rose Must Fall Oxford movement in 2015 says the Pitt Rivers Museum is the most violent space in Oxford, right? Because this is a weapon. This is not just a dispossession, it's a continued, it isn't just history. This is an act in the present in the same way as an image outdoors would be. So and so how is it that we've missed this? We've missed it because we are incredibly white institutions. We have underfunded world culture museums, as compared to European art museums, compared to a vision of civilization based on that. So we have to take the action to diversify ourselves, to make our institutions look like and to represent the wider audiences and cultures and immediate sort of neighbours who we say that we represent. So here in Oxford, we're doing positive action studentships, whereby the doctoral programme is actively, taking action to address underrepresentation, on ethnic and such grounds. But there's a lot to do. We cannot allow, though, these changes to wait until we have also diversified. It's all got to happen at once. So the physical dismantling, to dismantle and to reimagine and to repurpose. And a part for the Pitt Rivers, I think, will be to see us actually not only as a site that we dismantle through the crucial work of the return of objects when they're demanded, but also reimagining this site full of human remains of the brown and the black people who were killed under colonialism. I mean, sort of literally, you know, just yards away from me, from where I'm sitting here. We need to take such people, such ancestors off of the display, but we also need to recognize that these are war zones. These are sites, and therefore they have to turn into sites of conscience and sites of memory, and in part sites for facing up to all of the loss that came with empire.
I think that's so powerful what you're saying, Dan. And I think, you know, for some of the people who may be listening, they're not accustomed to thinking of the museum in that way, right? They're accustomed to thinking of the museum as a cultural institution, as a place for leisure and pleasure and spending a Sunday afternoon, not thinking of the museum as a political institution, as a space of power, as what you call a war zone, which is very, you know, powerful language. So, and I think that's what kind of links this conversation to the discourse of decolonization, which has always been about power, right? I mean, if we go, you know, to early 20th century decolonizing movements, these were always about reclaiming power, reimagining the world made by colonialism. You know, it's a political contest. So I'm wondering if any of you have kind of, if you want to weigh in. I mean, again, we have different types of audience who listen. And I think for some people, this idea of the museum as a weapon of war, not just a museum that show, not just a space that showcases war objects, but as a tool, as a technology of violence. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about more about that, Dan, or any of you, just to kind of flesh that out a little bit.
And so I'm happy to go first, just really quickly, just to observe that this is also about the violence that comes with knowledge. So anthropology, of course, had this central role, archaeology as well, this central role in the vision of sort of late 19th century white supremacy. And after, here in the UK, after we beat the fascists in 1945, one of the first acts that happened here at the Natural History Museum was the removal of the racist displays of ancestral skulls that had been arranged to tell the racist lie that there were different types of people, that different sorts of human species. Right next door in the Pitt Rivers Museum, the cultural displays that had been designed by the same people, the same discipline, to tell the same story, but using culture. And in many ways, this was the crisis for whiteness that happened after abolition and emancipation. So, okay, oh no, we're all now one human species. How do we show supremacy? Part of what came out of that, hand in hand with the physical anthropology, was a set of stories about cultural evolution and sort of cultural supremacy. Those displays are still with us. That is the justification for the so-called Universal Museum. All the Universal Museums, of course, sort of happen to be in the north, right? They happen to be the hyper concentration of objects that were taken under empire. So we have to recognize what the museum is. And I think that's the turn that's happening now. We're realizing that exactly the same has happened for science. And the scientists had no problem saying this is bad science. Let's just get rid of it. Let's take it off display. But we in the cultural world, who think of ourselves often as so much more aware of issues of identity and race, we've missed it. We've failed to understand what institutions like these are.
I want to sort of maybe take us back to Neil MacGregor's project, the History of the World with 100 Objects. And again, the premise of the project, which at the time was considered very exciting, is to present a history of the world based on multiple perspectives, based on objects chosen from different curatorial departments from the museum. And it was celebrated, I think, for a very short while, because I think once people looked at really what it is, it was reframing of the same idea of the power representation of what matters and what doesn't matter, what's culturally relevant, what's culturally not relevant, how in a sense, the imperial north saw ideas and artifacts and objects in different parts of the world and collected only what it decided is relevant and suitable. And those objects are in a sense hijacked, and now they're made to tell a story and whitewash a new world perspective. I was torn with the book, and I use it in teaching quite a lot with my students, because there is one aspect of it that seems, as Dan was saying earlier, that sort of, it seems like one step forward, but it is one step still within the same framework that is a colonial framework. And what we need to do parallel to that is from my perspective in my field, to deconstruct the structure of the museum itself. That notion that cultures are so hermetically sealed and each department has its own set. And, you know, I love the British Museum, but they still have a curatorial department called, what is it? Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. So that's, you know, in other words, the others. So I think we need to deconstruct these sort of rigid structures, but at the same time, we still can take these steps. So I don't know if I don't think we can do one as opposed to the other. I think we need to be working on all levels at the same time. And you know, as Chaédria was saying, activism is a big part of what we need to be doing.
You know, I always go back to cinema, because when you, well, who doesn't like watching movies? But, you know, cinema has so much to tell us. And I can't remember, it was in a New York Times article, but there was a curator who was saying that curators don't have media literacy. They don't understand film. And it's a shame, because so much, you know, curating borrows so much without even realizing that it does from theater and cinema, right? And so when you think about the rise of, you know, and I'm speaking very centrically the US, and specifically New York, because New York has this outsized impact on what kind of museums the rest of the world or the rest of the country would create, especially, you know, at the turn of the century, the early part of the 20th century. So, you know, the 20s and the 30s, you had the creation of pretty much the major museums in New York. And you also have the rise of the block, you know, the beginning of the blockbuster in American cinema. And, you know, you can't divorce that. Like, how are curators, you know, again, to Dan's point, we teach curating as this very rigid thing that can't move, but that's the paradox, because there's also not a composite history of the history of curating, right? So by definition and by training, it's an oral history. There's so much emphasis on, you have to learn on the ground, you have to learn through someone takes you under your wings, which I've always found that interesting, that we treat curating as an oral tradition, which is very much the provenance of the other, but we've kind of hermetically sealed it off as a discipline and as a practice with a capital D and P. So curating hasn't decided what it wants to be. And it's actually a very young field when you think about when you think about the history, when you compare it, shall I say, to the history of theater, the history of cinema, and sort of contemporary curating as we know it really arguably begins with Harold Seesman, so they say. So you're only talking about 50 or 60 years of contemporary curating as we know it, with the white box and et cetera, et cetera. So I say all of that background to say that we haven't really committed to the conversation of curating as propaganda, or that like how does, you know, to Dan's point, him saying, you know, the way in which the skulls are arranged, or Ruba, to your point about an art, you know, something's being deigned as an artifact, but it's a living, breathing thing that belongs actively to people who actively use it. So all of that is really propaganda, but we don't call it that. And I think what really sort of in the exercise of decolonizing, we are in what I call a languageless place. You know, we don't have a language for curating, the role of curating in these harms, which I think is a big part of it.
Speaking of that, Dan, maybe you can talk a little about, because you introduced some new language in your book about necrography, for example, which I don't know if you made that word up. It was, I mean, I'm aware of necropolitics, but I'm not aware. So did you make this word up? Because this seems to be like filling this language gap that Chaédria is talking about.
Absolutely, yeah. And so I did, I certainly made up some words in the book, I'm afraid, yeah. And the necrographic was one attempt to try and get past, and actually I just published a piece with some wonderful responses from colleagues in the BAJ, in the Art Journal here in the UK, which is about which is a short version of, what is this word? But essentially it's a critique of these, I found so many of the concepts from art history, anthropology, archaeology for talking about objects so inappropriate when we come to talk about objects that were taken with violence, that are indexes sort of not of sort of gain, but of loss. So when Hartwig Fischer at the BM in London says that the Elgin marbles or the Parthenon marbles were the taking of those marbles was a creative act, he is using, the reason he can say something so obviously wrong is that we're trained to think about every movement of an object as if it's a recontextualization, as if it's an addition, it's a new layer, on that object's sort of history. Whereas in fact, so many of these objects were taken with loss and violence and also death. I use Achille Mbembe's sort of inversion of the Foucauldian idea of the biopolitical, which he turns into necropolitics. He uses that to describe the regimes of who gets to live and who dies in the context of forced migration from Africa and sort of fortress Europe and the deaths every year in the Mediterranean. For objects and for museums, we need to find a similar language. But I'd also go on a rather more hopeful note. I would actually go back to the points that were just being made over visuality. And I think this conversation about sort of cinema is incredibly, important. So there is an argument about the most recent sort of moment of anti-racism, or the most recent sort of layers we've seen since 2015 in America. And my colleague Nick Mirzouf has written about this, that sense of the BLM movement as a fundamentally visual moment, because it was the dashcam footage and the cell phone footage that could make visible anti-Black violence that had been happening for centuries. It suddenly can be seen, it can be shared, and a new sort of a politics comes out of that. So what for museums does that look like in the present? Well, the argument I put in the book, and I think there is some hope here, that if we start to shine a light on the fact, the fact that so much of these objects we're talking about are in the stores and they're not even on display. So much of the violent histories which are being made endure into the present are sort of not seen at the moment. But the logic of saying someone's name is maybe has something we can learn from that in actually the pointing out of objects, the telling, of the histories and the identities of objects in museums, so we can talk about their return, so we can talk about their meaning in the present, and so we can start to dismantle through seeing some of this ongoing violence.
It's a lot to think about. I wanted to bring an example from from my field, from Islamic art, of objects that are taken, as we now have had raging wars in, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and so on. So war looting and sort of the role of the art market in the world in looting, and the fact that museums, even though we have the 1970 Convention of Provenance, of knowing where objects came from, making sure that they were exported from their countries of origin legally, and that these are objects that are that perhaps museums can acquire, you still have incidences where objects gets on the market and gets bought into a museum, and then you realize that that's, war booty, something that has been stolen. And actually only this week I was hopeful, because this week something that we've known about for a long time, theft that has been happening in Afghanistan, for example, from a 12th century palace that was built by a Muslim dynasty in Afghanistan, pieces of marble that are carved and were excavated by the Italians in the 50s, numbered and known where they are, suddenly appeared on the market in 2012, 2013, I think, and were bought by a museum in Germany. And now is the time that sort of in 2018, there was a big exhibition in Germany to say, we know that this is looted, and we've just discovered that it is looted, and actually we're going to return it back. And the whole question started, return it back, is it to Afghanistan, or return it back where the war is still ongoing, the potential of things being looted again is still ongoing. And that raises a debate. And as a result, it was returned to the embassy, to the Afghan embassy in Germany. And I think these are great conversations to have, because people use the excuse of, we'll be able to better take care of this, as an excuse for not engaging in real conversations about restitution. I thought it was very hopeful that something sort of that would be close to our hearts is in, the New York Times magazine, so more people would hear about it and there'd be less excuses for debates against restitution.
So one last question for all of you, and then we have many, many excellent questions in the Q&A. So, I mean, I'm hearing all of you basically say these are ongoing struggles, right? What is new here, really? So that leads me to wonder, why now? I mean, last week we had a conversation with Monique Scott, who is the director of museum studies at Bryn Mawr. She's here with us tonight. And she referred to what she calls a decolonizing industry, this sort of, like there's, and here we are. I mean, we're doing a whole year of decolonizing. I mean, it's really, there is a kind of industry. She has an excellent point. There is, I think, a disconnect between the fatigue felt by some scholars and activists and a general audience that remains somehow, or some general audiences, unaware of this language, unaware of these problems. So I'm wondering, why now? Dan, you've mentioned 2015, the Rhodes Must Fall movement. We have 2016, Decolonize This Place. Does an action at the Brooklyn Museum and continues to work after that. But there doesn't seem to be much traction, and perhaps, I don't know if there is traction now, but then there's 2020, the murder of George Floyd, and you certainly seem to see more institutions at least talking the talk. I don't know if they're walking the walk around anti-racism. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective, the why now, right? Why is there this urgency now to decolonize the museum?
Well, I can go with that. Elizabeth, we spoke yesterday about the question of George Floyd. And I, as you know, push back on that, because I would posit that sort of my show in 2019 and actively standing up to the former chief curator, Nancy Spector, and calling her out on tape, with the audacity of hosting a panel about my show with authors of my catalog, material that I own. And so, and I had been very active in saying that and consistently saying it. And then the Guggenheim curators, so the reason why I push back on that, it's not to center myself, not from a place of vanity, but history is not just the narrative, it's the material. And the truth is that the American art world has watched Black people be killed by the state on video for the better part of a decade. So it's not enough to say that George Floyd, that was merely the catalyst, because the history just doesn't show that. Because, you know, Eric Garner was hugely impactful. Ferguson, which kind of visually kicked off a lot of this, was hugely felt and moved, for instance, publications like women's magazines to respond. So I don't think that it's just that. I would say that, you know, again, as a curator, sitting atop that kind of power hierarchy, even though not being affiliated with an institution, it opened space. It showed an institution, or it showed an industry how you could use social media. And so you've got Change for the Museum, Cancel the Art Galleries, For the Culture, all of whom most of whom have sent me messages saying, we owe you a debt. But also they took a page from that playbook of how social media can be used to disrupt space. So I think that, and then, you know, the Guggenheim open letter, which is hugely problematic in that it was written without my permission. And so there's lots of conversations to be had about how, you know, my name or body was used to create space and also for publicity that they otherwise would not have been able to garner. But their letter then set off a chain reaction, but that all comes back to my literal body and space and agency and words. And so, of course, I'm not the only person. You know, Decolonize This Place has, you know, done amazing work and for a long time. But when you start talking about curators or people even having the gall to name names, even anonymously, that there was no precedent before that. And in terms of why that space, so an opening was made, and then, you know, we're still, I think, in the beginning stages of that. But I think that it was a couple of things, but I think that it was that risk which allowed people to see that, you know, people are not fallible and empires are infallible, and empires are certainly not forever, whether that's the British Empire or the museum empire. And certainly the Guggenheim is absolutely an empire with a presence on, you know, 2.5 continents.
Dan, Ruba, any thoughts on why now? Why the urgency? Why this momentum?
Well, I come from a field that's been uncomfortable with itself for a very long time. You know, calling something Islamic art, calling an art after a religion, a faith where 1/4 of the world population follow that religion, and then the art that is supposed to be Islamic art represents just 20% of that, and it's based on exclusion. It excludes the majority of Muslims in the world. So, for example, in the representation of Africa, North Africa counts, but Sub-Saharan Africa does not count in Islamic art museums. So the field has been uncomfortable for a while and looking for ways to decolonize its own language and its own representation within the museum. I think, but the moment of 9/11 for Islamic art, where some atrocious action was perpetrated in the name of Islam, or at least it was said to be in the name of Islam, made people want to use that moment. And over the last 20 years, we've had 18 galleries and museums have reinstalled and tried to address issues of what do we mean when we say Islamic art, and why is this a colonial construct? And so there's been both discomfort and attempts. And again, those attempts are not anti-colonial in the sense that they're still working within the same structures, as we were talking about Dan before, the same structures. So you want to broaden areas of representation, but you can't, because that's your curatorial domain in a sense. And I think a good example of the urgency of now, the moment the George Floyd moment pushed that forward. The main historians of Islamic Art Association usually gives an annual postdoctoral fellowship, for example. And this year, as a committee, we decided that we want to give that to someone who's working on those voices that are usually not represented in Islamic art. We want to work at someone working on decolonization, someone working on areas that are not represented. So for us, that would be Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, areas that are not considered the canon, to, the canon as a colonial construct, as an imperial idea. So in a sense, it's been coming, but I think the current moment is urgent and showed the urgency of it, and I think the field is responding. But as Chaédria said, the expertise to be able to support that, the academic expertise to be able to support that act of decolonization, are developing at the same time that the conversation is happening. So I think I'm hopeful for the future.
Absolutely, yes. And I think if I can just add, what is so important here, as we've just heard, is the linking of the decolonization of museums to the wider conversations about the decolonization of knowledge and of what we teach in our institutions. So, I mean, why now for the Pitt Rivers? I mean, my answer to some degree is that a stopped watch is going to tell the right time every 130 years or so, right? And that's just, the Pitt Rivers has just stayed the same, and it has turned into an important space, for having this conversation. At the same time, I think we need to recognize that in the case of, say, returns, restitution, that is a process that has already become, in the 90s, it sort of turned into a central part of what we do already for Holocaust spoliation and for First Nations and the return of ancestral remains. Somehow Africa and somehow cultural objects, which often do not just symbolize, but constitute ancestors for source communities, somehow we've left those issues out. And so I think, sort of how far we got in the 90s, here in the UK, of course, it was the racist killing of Stephen Lawrence in 1994, and the subsequent report in 1999, and so where the Macpherson report sort of introduced into public life in the UK the idea of institutional racism, and the idea that we're dealing with institutions where the structures and the modes of thinking, all the things we've been talking about over the course of this conversation, are where the racism sort of operates and sort of how it works. So that means that what we mean by the decolonization of knowledge is not simply expanding to the areas that have been neglected. There is an approach from some historians in the UK to think, hey, this is great. The whole agenda for the decolonial means a whole load of other jobs. We're going to get some more jobs for historians of East Africa, historians of South India. This is great. And there's another group of us who are saying, no, this is about the decolonization of the whole way in which sort of knowledge is organized. This is about citation practices. This is about the history of the discipline. This is about who you hire. This is about whether you represent and whether you look like the societies that you write about and the contemporary world that you're in. so that we have the same fight going on in our universities as we have in our museums.
Wonderful. So we have about 20 minutes or so. I'm going to let my colleague, Tim McCall, field the questions. So if you have questions, I see some of you making comments in chat, which is great. But if you have a question you'd like to pose to the panelists, if you would please pose that question in the Q&A, which is a button you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Tim?
Yeah, so yeah, we have at least, we'll say we have at least 20 minutes because we have a lot of awesome questions. And I think, well, the one question I've gotten, or that we've gotten the most, I can answer myself real briefly, which is this conversation will be posted online. It usually takes about a week. And I also recommend that, you know, for those of you who are interested, to go back and look at some of the earlier conversations from on decolonizing land, decolonizing empire, decolonizing the curriculum, and also last week's talk by Dr. Monique Scott, which was a great sort of introduction to the possibilities and limitations maybe of decolonizing museums and art, and also talked about some of these sort of dioramas and cultural exhibits that staged evolution and supremacy and progress that have been mentioned a few times. So for those of you all interested in that, please look for that video and soon look for this video also for students. But let me start with a question from Frida Anderson, a high school teacher. Her 11th grade students have been working with alumni from an old closed down school and a museum within the museum, all about school closures. So the museum is about school closures and how funding can impact and traumatize communities. We are community sourcing the objects. So the people who the museum is about are the ones choosing to donate or loan their objects to the museum. And they're helping to plan out the space. But in a museum that already has objects, this is the question, how can we get the people who the museum is supposedly about to be part of the actual curating process? Is it possible to go back and involve people who have been so intentionally disconnected and cut out of the museum before? So that's who, I don't know who wants to start.
So, you know, I can just use an example with the show, right? Like with the 80s, the artists of the 80s, it was an opportunity to have a generation of artists, both living and not, in the museum space. So it's not quite the same thing, but it was also, so in doing that, I also was super aware of the feedback that I had heard for months, which is, you know, I lived in Harlem, which is right around the corner from the Guggenheim, and people were like, I've never been there. It's not for me. And so the way in which I, you know, I don't know if it's the same question that you're asking. It to me was not possible to engage them in the history of the Guggenheim. It was just too much and too violent, but rather, and it wasn't the focus, but rather it was super important to me that Michael Stewart's family be involved. So, you know, and that proved to be crucial because there were things, for instance, that Nancy Spector just didn't know how to do or didn't understand. And so we had at one point Michael Stewart's sister having to edit her work. And that would have never have happened if, you know, I hadn't insisted on this family must be front and center. So a parallel to that is, I don't know if you're publishing anything, but, you know, having, you know, the blind spots you don't even know until they show up, but having like being able to defer, but also like use the parts of the technical expertise that can support what they're trying to say, that so that it's a win-win for everyone. That didn't necessarily happen on my show, but I could see where there was a path forward. It was just institutional arrogance and ignorance that prevented that, but it is possible, I think.
Yeah, and so you know, I would add to those important points, you know, how important, you know, co-curation is, that so much of that old authority voice of the curator now has to become the co-curator with the Calais Lond show, which we held here at the museum in 2019, which was about the material culture of a contemporary refugee camp at the UK national border at Calais. That co-curation process with 4 men who had lived at the camp, had made an irregular crossing to the UK, and had got each of them a right to remain, and were working as artists in the UK from sort of Sudan and also the Middle East. You know, actually that sort of process really sort of certainly led me into a whole set of having to having to allow others, you know, to make or to have that central role in sort of saying, actually, I mean, what will be in this exhibit and what are we going to say and how is it going to be described? I also think, I mean, we can really learn from how the museum is being reimagined in Africa at the moment. So that idea of a museum that cares more for your people than for things, you know, whether it's at the District 6 Museum in the South African context, sort of where apartheid is remembered, and there's a healing process, and there's a memory that goes on there in the museum space, or other sorts of museums where that idea that the museum isn't the end point, it isn't a sort of, you know, it isn't a jailhouse, it's a site for art and for culture and for action, for living, for music and performance. So there are all sorts of other models which are outside of the usual Western canon of ideas of the museum that I think allow us to have some hope that we can reimagine the museum in a way that foregrounds sort of ways of seeing the world which are outside of an Enlightenment or a European vision.
Ruba, did you want to say anything, or should I mean, we also have lots of questions too, so I don't want to.
That's what I was thinking. There's lots of questions, and I agree.
Okay. Oh, good. I want everyone to have a chance. So Bailey Bagmanon asks, with much criticism that colonial powers, France in particular, are receiving in terms of returning or not returning indigenous pieces, such as the bronzes that Dan has written so much about. One, is international criticism the only route to return these indigenous artworks? Should colonial powers pay reparations to these countries?
Yes, they should. I think that when you're talking about empire, they understand a language of money and of violence and of power. As I said earlier, we've already had these conversations. We've been having them for decades. In some cases, we're going on a century plus. You know, we are not going to talk our way out of this. If that were the case, it would have already been done. So it's a matter of what chess piece will move first.
And so absolutely, but I also think it's important that while the conversation between the formerly colonized nation and the former colonizing nation is such a central part of what the restitution movement is, and how in that case reparations and a whole set of other conversations have to be part of the mix as well, let's not remember, or let's ensure that we remember how many non-state actors are involved here. So both in Africa and around the world across the South, how many sort of occasions in which we're talking about sort of kingdoms or, you know, local communities who are making the claims. And even in the UK, you know, in the USA, elsewhere in Europe, sort of, if you like, in these conversations, So many of the museums are not a part of the nation state. I mean, I'm here at the University of Oxford. We are not a nation state. We are a university. Look at the Ivy League schools that have so many African objects. Look at the city museums, and there's a list of them in the back of the book in terms of the Benin objects. But we can widen that out. I mean, here in the UK, I've argued you're never more than 150 miles away from a looted African object, and that means that local conversations can be had in Ipswich and in Belfast and in Edinburgh and in sort of Birmingham, rather than it always only being about the sort of conversation in sort of London. So a big part of my own intervention has been to try to say that this old idea that Africans want returns and the curators want to keep things, and that's it, there are two sides of it, to come forward and say, well, actually, there is a new generation of those of us that work in museums that see restoration as a central part of what we do is very important. But I absolutely agree that financial, and let's not go into the idea that we need to sort of train the world in how to build a museum on a European model or an American model. All the neo-colonialism we see with the training programs and the capacity building, sort of all of that is a distraction from the crucial work of the returns, but also of all these other all of the other R's, the remembrance and the recognition and the reparations and the restitution and the returns.
You know, I do believe that to heal and move forward, we have to remember. And as a result, I do believe that restitution is something very important to think about. But I always believe in the sort of the working together both for the restitution. And unlike you, Dan, I do believe that ideas of sort of training and education and so on are part of the payback. It's not all of the payback. It's an important part of the payback, because after all, those artifacts have had a different life in their colonial context, and I do not want to underestimate the importance of training, education, but I don't think it should be the only thing. So I'm with you, but I don't want to underestimate the education aspect of it.
So I'll move to the Andreina Soto, who's one of our recent grad students, mentions that she loves the idea of reimagining museum collections and how we envision professionalization and in and outside academia. She asks the panelists, how can we foster meaningful exchanges between universities and museums that turn into structural change? I'm curious to know, Ruba, too, about your move from the Aga Khan to University of Toronto, and maybe you could start off that.
Yes, I think actually, let me start by saying I felt that I was a better academic after I worked in a museum, worked with artifacts closely, learned about the curatorial practice firsthand, and then moved back to academia. And I think I moved back to academia with a very different approach to the teaching of Islamic art. So, I'll give you an example from what we're doing now in COVID. I find that the best way to teach students about representation and the racialization of representation is not only to send them into museums, but also to send them to museum websites, because museum websites tell you so much about education and tell you about representation and about what is it that we need to dismantle structurally from a museum's way of representing an art and a collection and a racialized people, because you will see it in black and white on their museum website, the way they're presenting the collection and discussing the collection. And it is brilliant to see how students, young, fresh minds who live in the moment of Black Lives Matter are looking at these structures that we take so much for granted as research tools and look at them as objects of representation.
maybe, does anyone, should I go to maybe Paul Steggy's question, one of our colleagues who, you know, if we think about decolonizing the museum, does that suggest museums' acts of colonizing lie in the past? He gives the example of the the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, a new institution which is physically in a rebuilt imperial palace, and also conceptually seems to reprise German colonial practices. I mean, I think, we've heard from all of you that the museums continue to colonize. Yeah, maybe you could expand. You all could expand on that.
Can you repeat the question again?
Essentially, does the idea of decolonizing the museum, does that suggest that museums' acts of colonizing lies in the past?
No, I don't think so. I think also with the uprisings that we've seen in the last year, you know, the Colonial project also extends to the people who work in the museums. You know, the way in which, at least in the States, and certainly I know, you know, was it the workers at the Tate? You know, I've seen their Instagram. This idea that, you know, James Baldwin talks about empire in terms of what you do to me inevitably happens to you, right? And so this exploitation of and plunder and violence and sort of this violence that we're talking about that happens to the object, that happens to the land, that happens to the people, invariably comes home to roost, right? To paraphrase Malcolm X, those chickens come home to roost. And so when we talk about the museum, we talk about workers who don't have adequate health care, don't have, you know, art handlers for whom there's no exhibition without the people who literally put the art on the wall. So often they're working without insurance. So that kind of exploitation, right? When you've got museums that are worth billions of dollars in terms of the endowed, they may not be that liquid, but they have assets, and there are people who are on public assistance, which happens happens in galleries, as you know. That's a longer story, but it's just to say that those things. So the Colonial project is happening in real time, right? The Colonial project is an extraction of wealth, wherever that's coming from, whether that's labor or brilliance or object. And so the radicalization and decolonization also means caring for your workers. Because, you know, when you've got museum directors who are making $900,000 and art handlers that are making, I don't know, maybe 15, and it's unstable, or 86 museum educators are wiped off of the payroll, that's a colonial act.
I just actually think that the Humboldt Forum is a very good example for something that we've mentioned earlier, that tension between sort of decolonizing through the idea of programming that will perhaps introduce new ideas, or dismantling the colonial structure altogether. And I think the fact that the Humboldt Foundation is something that is just happening now in front of us puts that dichotomy of the issue, of the question, right in the center. And I don't know what the answer is for that, because I think we have to remember that museums are institutions with funding and with a perceived financial value and so on. And as a result, that changing of what those museums are will take much more than the programming that the Humboldt is planning to do. And I think this is where the issue arises as there is two things working at the same time. And, you know, the Humboldt is happening now in 2021.
Yes, absolutely. And so I just put in the messaging a cartoon that I think sort of sums some of this up, which is Humboldt Forum saying Nigeria called and they want back the Benin bronzes, and Humboldt Forum say, oh, it's too bad. We need them for our project on the history of German colonialism. And then the reply from Nigeria is, well, okay, the history is one thing. How about the present? How about, you know, those same processes in the present? So we have to be incredibly careful. I mean, how on earth Humboldt Forum continues, I really don't know. But we have to be so careful, I think, that we don't allow this moment to become a bit like the Berlin moment of 1884, the scramble for Africa. Let's not see a scramble for decolonization, where these very reflexive and sensitive, sort of, you know, newly self-aware institutions start to recenter themselves yet again, and the white curators recenter themselves and take up the space yet again. Right? I mean, we saw it in the 90s in anthropology with the reflexive turn of you know, the sort of, you know, Jim Clifford moment. That idea that you just had to be really sensitive about these histories and to tell them really honestly and to be self-aware. I mean, of course, that isn't enough. You need to dismantle. So yeah, I think, I mean, fundamentally, we're in a moment where we have to begin from the observation that empire is with us in the present. So in terms of the Benin example, it's very interesting because Nigeria, of course, as a colony, did not exist when the Benin bronzes were taken. It was a protectorate. It was these informal forms of empire that were so important and so violent. That's what we're talking about. So, of course, the fact that Nigeria got independence, that doesn't mean that those other indirect, informal forms of empire went away, and they live on in our institutions. We have to be very aware of the difference between simply a settler colonialist versus extractive colonialist, sort of a distinction, but also other sort of institutional forms where at the moment, again, as we were saying earlier, we don't have the words for this. We can't quite express sort of what these different forms of oppression and of dispossession and of objectification and of violence really are. But we need to find those words, and we need to find a way to describe and to redescribe Humboldt Forum and other such institutions.
You know, just to kind of piggyback briefly on what you said, sort of, I think we are stuck in this narrative that everyone learned in the 90s of the post-racial, and you know, that sort of thing, and I think that, you know, kind of going back to the archive of visual culture and what has visual culture always meant to empire, right? Back to the Romans, to the Greeks, to the Egyptians, and I'm hugely paraphrasing to speed it up, but you know, the crisis of modern Europe, or any sort of white presenting or white centering empires, this crisis of what is white identity as it is, not in objection, not in contrast, but what is it, right? Which goes back to the slave laws of Virginia, which were then exported to Barbados and Jamaica, which really, North Carolina and Virginia, I'm blanking on the year, but basically they defined what Black was, but not what white was. It was just what white wasn't this. And so there's been this crisis of whiteness in the modern era of what it is. not what it isn't, but what it is. And so, so when I see this tension with the Benin bronzes and the Humboldt Institute, and there's a real crisis with white museums to define what they are without Blackness, without the other, without the former colonies, without Islamic art, whatever that is. So all of these things are figments of the imagination, but what is it in reality? And I think that's really the crisis that we're talking about on some level.
Wonderful.
Well,
yeah, go ahead. We try here at the LaPage Center to be timely. It's 7:38. We know our panelists, Dan in particular, I don't even know what time it is in England, but it's tomorrow. So it's tomorrow, right? So I know Tim wants to, we're so thankful to all of you for joining us and participating and sending your excellent questions. The conversation continues next week. Tim would like to kind of say a few words before we wrap up.
Yeah, real briefly, and for those of you who have been to these before, like I'm amazed we're 6 minutes over. Dr. Kulski is the boss, and she usually, I mean, it just shows how much fun we're having and how much we're learning, or at least I am. So I want to thank all the panelists sincerely, and also call everyone's attention to next Wednesday at 12:30 for the third of these decolonizing museums and art conversations and lectures. So Terry Greaves, an artist, and Jill Albergioa, a curator, are going to talk about their 2019 exhibition, Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists, which took place at the Minneapolis Museum of Art, and is in a lot of ways was very groundbreaking for for engaging with Indigenous curatorial practices and rethinking what in a lot of interesting ways what an exhibition could be. And I'd recommend for those of you all who are interested in art history or curatorial practices, both the exhibition catalog itself, which is fabulous. And then there was a recent, and maybe the last issue or two of the Art Bulletin, a very substantial review of the exhibition that raised a lot of issues that we've been talking about all year in this series. So I don't know, Elizabeth, I just wanted to say that if you want to close this off, but I want to thank everyone for being here, and especially the panelists.
Okay, so again, thank you all for joining us tonight. This conversation will be posted on our YouTube channel within a week or so. We hope, as Tim mentioned, you stay with us next week and also next month when we culminate the event with a series on decolonizing COVID, which looks at, again, histories of public health inequities across time, racial inequalities as it pertains to vaccines and vaccinations, not only in the present, but in the past. So on that note, I will bid you all farewell and good night, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.